They were ready to die for the emperor. Instead, they tasted hamburgers, Coca-Cola, and mercy they had never imagined. This is the story of the prisoners who were broken by kindness. The Pacific was endless. For 3 weeks, the ship cut across gray waters, carrying men who once believed capture was worse than death. They were officers, soldiers, mechanics, farmers, men who had sworn an oath to the emperor that surrender was shame beyond forgiveness. Now they stood on the deck, wrapped in American wool blankets, watching the horizon blur into clouds. Some prayed silently. Others refused to speak. One man kept his eyes fixed on the ocean, repeating a single word under his breath. Baka, baka, fool. He wasn't speaking of the enemy. He was speaking of himself. Beneath deck, the air was thick with salt and oil. They slept in rows of canvas bunks, their breath fogging the cold air. Food came twice a day: bread, soup, coffee. For men raised on rice and miso, the taste was alien. Some ate mechanically, without emotion. Others hesitated, unsure whether the strange kindness was real or cruel illusion. The guards were polite, even quiet. They didn't strike or shout. They simply watched, hands resting on their belts, eyes distant. To the Japanese soldiers, this was the first fracture in everything they had been taught. In the Imperial army, mercy was weakness. Compassion was treason. The enemy was not human. But here aboard an American transport ship somewhere between Guam and San Francisco, the impossible was happening. Their enemy had given them warmth. Their captors had given them food, and no one could understand why. In the journals recovered after the war, one prisoner wrote, "I thought they would kill us on the ocean. Instead, they gave us soup. I did not know what to feel. I could not stop crying." As the ship neared the American coast, the cold wind carried new smells: pine, smoke, and something sweet. Home was thousands of miles away. But ahead of them stood the enemy's homeland, a land they had been taught to fear and despise. None of them could imagine that what waited there was not punishment, but kindness so disarming it would shake the foundations of their beliefs. For these men, the war was over, but the hardest battle was just beginning. They expected the land of monsters. Propaganda in Japan had described America as a place of chaos, a country of criminals, slaves, and cowards. But when the ship finally docked, what they saw instead was order. The harbor was quiet, efficient. Trucks moved in lines. Soldiers worked with precision, not anger. There were no jeers, no beatings, no hatred in the air. Only procedure. The Japanese prisoners were counted, photographed, and searched. Their names were written carefully, each character traced with attention. One guard even helped a prisoner fix his torn sleeve. For men who had prepared to meet barbarism, such civility was confusing, even frightening. The convoy of trucks rolled north through snow-covered fields, past small towns and frozen rivers. Through the canvas flaps, prisoners saw children waving, American children smiling at them. They didn't understand why. In Tokyo, school children were told that Americans were demons. Here, it was the demons who smiled first. By nightfall, the convoy reached Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, a sprawling complex of wooden barracks surrounded by pine forests and snow. The men stepped out into the cold. Their breath turned to mist. Then came the second shock. Inside the barracks were not cages or concrete cells, but stoves, bunks, blankets, and even books. A voice over the loudspeaker welcomed them in halting Japanese. "You are prisoners of war. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." The interpreter repeated the words twice. Few believed him. That night, the prisoners were given their first full meal on American soil: stew with meat, bread with butter, and hot coffee. Some refused to eat, fearing poison. Others tasted it cautiously, then paused. surprised at the warmth, the salt, the richness of flavor they hadn't felt in years. In the next bunk, one man whispered, "If this is how they treat enemies, how do they treat their own?" The guard on duty heard the whisper. He didn't understand the words, but he saw the faces. The exhaustion was still there. The pride was still there. But something else had appeared, doubt. Doubt that everything they had been taught was true. In that moment, in a wooden barrack in the middle of Wisconsin, the first battle of hearts had quietly begun. Morning in Camp McCoy began with a sound they had not heard in years. Laughter. It came from the kitchen where American cooks joked over trays of bread and steaming stew. For the prisoners, the smell alone was a shock. Warm, rich, full of things they could not name. Each man received a tin plate, a spoon, a slice of white bread, a small pat of butter. For many, it was the first time they had seen butter at all. The main dish, a patty of ground beef between two pieces of bread. The Americans called it a hamburger. One prisoner stared at his plate, puzzled. Another asked the guard through the interpreter if it was dog meat. The guard smiled, shook his head, and simply said, "It's beef." Slowly, cautiously, they took the first bites. The taste was overwhelming. Salt, grease, heat, softness. For men who had lived for years on rice, dried fish, and watery soup, the rush of flavor was almost painful. Some laughed, others froze mid-bite. One soldier dropped his burger and began to cry quietly, his shoulders shaking. Another reached out and touched his arm, unsure whether it was grief or gratitude. Across the hall, an American guard whispered to another, "They're crying, over lunch." For the prisoners, it wasn't just food, it was confusion. Everything they had been taught about the enemy, cruelty, chaos, barbarism, was dissolving with every mouthful. In Imperial training, hunger was considered noble. Pain was purity. Here the enemy fed them until they were full. One officer wrote in his diary that night, "The first bite was victory and defeat together. Victory for the body, defeat for the spirit." After the meal, the prisoners were led outside for roll call. Snowflakes fell softly onto the muddy ground. One soldier looked at the sky and murmured, "If they treat us like this." What kind of world did we fight against? It was a question no one could answer. Inside the kitchen, the cooks cleaned the trays, unaware they had just changed 100 lives. Not with words or weapons, but with food. It began as a rumor. The Americans were bringing bottles of something. Glass, dark, with bubbles that hissed like gas. Some thought it was medicine. Others thought it was poison. When the crates arrived, even the guards smiled. Each prisoner was handed a single bottle, cold to the touch, droplets of condensation shining like frost. The label was strange, English letters, bold and curved, a symbol of the enemy's culture in liquid form. A few refused to open it. One officer stared at the cap, whispered, "Is this how they finish us?" Another shrugged, twisted the top, and the hiss filled the room. The first sip was electric. Sweetness, fizz, ice-cold shock. The men looked at one another in disbelief. Some laughed out loud. Others coughed, choking from surprise. One man covered his face and began to sob. The guard didn't understand what was happening. To him it was just soda. But to the prisoners it was something else. A taste of the impossible. In Japan, Coca-Cola was an exotic legend. A drink for the rich, whispered about in foreign films. For soldiers who had fought to the last bullet, who had watched friends starve on island jungles, this cold sweetness felt almost obscene. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't kindness. It was contradiction. In that moment, the war, all its words, its pride, its logic, lost its shape. How could a nation capable of such destruction also invent something so simple, so joyful? A diary entry from a Japanese medic captured it best. "I hated them. But when I drank it, I wanted to understand them." Outside, snow fell quietly on the barracks roof. Inside, the prisoners passed the bottles around, tapping them like glasses in a silent toast. For the first time, they weren't soldiers or enemies, just men, tired, alive, tasting something they didn't have a word for. The interpreter later wrote, "That day I realized what we were fighting." Not soldiers, a way of life. The next morning, one of the guards placed a single empty Coca-Cola bottle on a shelf in the mess hall. He didn't know it would become a relic, a reminder that even in war, understanding could come from the smallest of things. By January of 1945, the prisoners were allowed to write home. 2 letters a month. Censored, translated, approved. For men who hadn't touched paper in years, it felt like touching their past. The first letters were simple. I am alive. I am healthy. Do not worry. But soon the words became heavier. Not with what was written, but with what had to be left unsaid. They wanted to tell their families that they were warm, that they ate meat and bread, and drank strange sweet water from glass bottles, that the enemy gave them blankets, soap, even books. But every sentence that hinted at kindness was crossed out in red ink by the American censor's pen. It wasn't malice. It was procedure. But for the prisoners, it felt like erasure. The truth was too unbelievable to survive the journey home. One wrote, "If I tell my wife that our captors feed us better than our officers ever did, she will think I have lost my mind." Another, "I do not know what to say. The world is turned upside down and I must describe it standing on my head." The letters that passed through censorship became fragments, polite phrases stripped of wonder, sterile notes sent across the ocean. Yet the truth still slipped through, between the lines. The food here is enough. We see snow every day. They treat us according to rules. In Japan, when these letters arrived, wives and parents gathered in temples to read them aloud. Many wept, not from relief, but from confusion. The words were calm, too calm, no hatred, no anger, only stillness, as if their sons had fallen into another world. The Tokyo press later published an editorial mocking the letters, calling them enemy propaganda. But the families who held those envelopes knew otherwise. There was something in the handwriting, a softness, a peace they had never seen before. One mother wrote in her diary, "If this is captivity, then perhaps our sons have found the mercy that Japan has forgotten." For the prisoners, those censored pages were the first bridge between two worlds, one built on honor, the other on humanity. And somewhere between the red lines of ink, they began to understand that the war they were fighting had already ended, not in victory or surrender, but in revelation. The first cracks did not come from hunger or fear. They came from kindness. In February 1945, the war was still raging in the Pacific. Tokyo under fire, Okinawa not yet fallen. But inside the American camps, another war had begun. The war inside the mind. Every day the prisoners worked, ate, rested, and waited. Not for release, but for understanding. They could not hate the enemy who fed them. They could not despise the guard who smiled at them. They could not explain how compassion could come from those they were told were beasts. In the Imperial Code, mercy from the enemy was humiliation. In reality, it was salvation. And that was harder to bear. One officer, Lieutenant Nakamura, stopped eating for 3 days. He told his comrades, "If they are good men, then everything I believed is a lie." Another, Sergeant Ito, began bowing to American guards each morning, not from fear, but confusion. He later wrote, "I wanted to hate them. But every time they treated me like a man, I forgot how." At night, the prisoners gathered in silence. They spoke of home, of honor, of ghosts. One man confessed, "I fear that my spirit will not return to Japan. It has already surrendered here." The camp psychologist noted the change. The prisoners no longer walked in lines. They no longer saluted when guards passed. Their discipline had melted, replaced not by rebellion but by stillness. The Americans called it adjustment, but for the Japanese it was collapse, the death of the warrior spirit that defined them. When news arrived that Tokyo had been bombed again, some men cried openly, not for the city, but for their mothers, their wives, their children. The guards brought them blankets. One of them said softly, "It's over soon." No one answered. They didn't know what over meant anymore. For years, they had believed that death was the only honorable end, but now living itself had become the greater challenge, because it required forgiveness. And forgiveness, in the language of warriors, had no translation. The Americans did not win the prisoners with food alone. They won them with something the Japanese could not measure: values. In the spring of 1945 at Camp McCoy, an unusual meeting was held. Around a wooden table sat officers, chaplains, and psychologists. Their task was not strategy or weapons. It was something far more complicated. How do you defeat an enemy without destroying his humanity? Captain Robert Greene, a camp psychologist, believed he had the answer. If we treat them as men, they will stop thinking like soldiers. His report, dated March 1945, outlined a radical philosophy, one that the U.S. Army would later call re-education through dignity. It began with small things. Let them read books. Let them play baseball. Let them keep a photograph of their families. Greene wrote, "The sword cannot survive in a room full of laughter." To the Japanese mind, this approach was unthinkable. In their own camps, prisoners were tools, stripped of identity. Here in America, they were being rebuilt piece by piece as individuals. One U.S. officer described it simply, "We fight for freedom." So we must prove what freedom looks like. The prisoners were given English lessons, films, even discussions on democracy. Not propaganda, but participation. "We never told them to love America," Greene wrote. "We just let them see it." For many Japanese officers, this was far more dangerous than any weapon. The kindness disarmed them. It questioned everything they believed about strength, loyalty, and pride. An interpreter recalled, "They came to realize that power was not cruelty. It was calm. It was control without violence." In April, a Red Cross inspection team arrived. They reported that Camp McCoy had the highest morale of any POW camp in the continental United States. The prisoners had stopped trying to escape, not because they feared punishment, but because they no longer saw a reason to run. The war outside was still burning. But inside the camp, something remarkable had happened. The enemy had been defeated, not through domination, but through decency. As Captain Greene concluded in his report, "If they ever go home, let them remember this. Not the power of our guns, but the power of our kindness." While the prisoners in America discovered warmth, others, thousands of miles away, were learning the opposite lesson. In the jungles of Burma, in the islands of the Philippines, in the camps of Formosa and Singapore, Allied soldiers endured a reality stripped of mercy. Where the Geneva Convention guided American camps, Imperial camps followed a different code. One where surrender erased your right to exist. In the Japanese language, there was no word for POW, only Senko, survivor. A word that carried shame, not protection. The men captured in Bataan, Java, and Sumatra were not tortured for pleasure. They were broken for principle. To the Japanese command, discipline and obedience were absolute virtues. Pity was a defect. So they built camps the way they built their army: strict, silent, unbending. A British lieutenant later wrote, "They believed that to suffer was to become pure. And they made us pure." Yet even in those places, the human heart refused to die. Prisoners carved crosses from bamboo. They built makeshift radios. They shared the last spoon of rice between 6 men. When the war ended and the survivors returned home, many refused to speak of what they had seen, not from fear, but from disbelief. How could two nations fighting the same war build such different prisons? One fed its captives with warmth. The other starved them with honor. In the archives of the Red Cross, a single sentence stands out written in pencil. Compassion, like cruelty, is a choice. Each nation made its own. For the men who lived through both sides, the comparison was unbearable. Some American soldiers, when told of the kindness shown to Japanese POWs in the U.S., refused to believe it. "You mean we fed them steak while our boys were starving in Burma?" one veteran asked. But history rarely gives fair trades. The cruelty of one side does not justify the mercy of another. Oh, it only magnifies it. Because mercy, when given freely, is not repayment. It is a decision to end the circle. Spring came slowly to Wisconsin. The snow melted first on the roofs, then along the roads that led to the forest. Inside the camp, the prisoners had changed. The guards noticed it first. The bows were gone, the fear had faded. The men walked differently now. Not as soldiers, not as captives, but as people returning to themselves. They began to talk, not about the emperor or the war, but about home, about gardens, about trains, about the sound of rain on the tatami mats. One day when an American truck broke down at the gate, 3 prisoners ran to help. No one ordered them to. The guards hesitated, hands on their rifles, and then watched as the Japanese men pushed the truck together, laughing, their breath fogging in the cold. It was small, almost invisible, but it meant everything. For the first time, there was no us and them. Only men, tired of fighting the world, and themselves. In the evenings, the Americans sometimes left the radio on. Jazz, baseball scores, advertisements for things the prisoners couldn't imagine, toothpaste, refrigerators, cars. The men sat by the window listening in silence. One of them, a teacher from Nagasaki, whispered, "This is the sound of peace." A few began to learn English words. Thank you. Tomorrow. Home. And somewhere between those simple phrases, the walls that had divided two worlds began to crack. The camp commander wrote in his April report, "They have stopped dreaming of death. Now they speak of planting trees when they return." Even the American guards began to change. One sergeant wrote to his wife, "They are not what we were told. They pray, they sing, they miss their mothers. They are us, only on the other side of the ocean." The war was not over yet, but here inside a quiet camp in Wisconsin, peace had already begun. Quietly, invisibly, like the first green shoots beneath the snow. The news arrived like a whisper carried by the wind. August 6th, 1945. A voice on the radio, calm and distant, reading the bulletin. An American aircraft has dropped a new type of bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The words were simple, but for the men listening, time stopped. Hiroshima. It was not just a name, it was home. One man dropped his cup. Another ran out into the yard, shouting his sister's name. The guards froze. They didn't understand the language, but they understood the sound of heartbreak without translation. No photographs, no official details, only a rumor that the city was gone. That morning, the camp fell silent. The men refused breakfast. They sat outside in the dust, staring north toward a horizon they could not see. When the second bomb fell on Nagasaki, the silence deepened into something sacred. Some prayed, some laughed bitterly, saying, "So this is how gods destroy men." Others said nothing. There were no words in any language for a city that could vanish in an instant. Captain Green wrote in his report that week, "They no longer speak of victory or defeat. They speak only of ashes." One prisoner carved a single line into the wall of his barrack. "The war followed us even here." The Americans in the camp didn't celebrate. They had seen the faces of those whose families lived beneath that cloud. One sergeant whispered to his friend that night, "We may have ended the war, but I think we just broke the world." For the prisoners, that day was not the end. It was the moment they finally understood the scale of what humanity had done. And that no side, no flag, no victory could make sense of it. They were soldiers once. But in that silence, they became something else. Witnesses. In the autumn of 1945, the war ended, not with cheers, but with silence. Ships crossed the Pacific carrying men who were no longer soldiers. They had left as warriors. They returned as ghosts. At Yokohama and Sasebo, the ports filled with families, mothers, wives, children clutching faded photographs. But not everyone came to meet them. In Japan, captivity was still shame. The emperor had surrendered, yet for many, the idea of surrender remained unforgivable. When the first groups of prisoners stepped onto the docks, some were greeted with tears, others with silence. A few were told not to return home at all. They carried nothing save only letters, drawings, and a strange memory, kindness from the enemy. One former officer wrote in his diary, "In America they fed us, clothed us, treated us like men. Here they look at us as if we are already dead." Reporters asked what life in captivity was like. Most refused to answer, but one, a young lieutenant from Kyushu, spoke softly into the microphone. "They gave us hamburgers." And Coca-Cola. The audience laughed nervously, not knowing whether to pity or despise him. He continued, "It tasted like freedom." The papers didn't print his words, but among the returning men, that sentence became a whisper, passed from one to another like a prayer. It tasted like freedom. In the years that followed, those men would live quietly, working as teachers, carpenters, gardeners. Few ever spoke of America again, but on summer evenings, some were seen sitting by the river, sipping from bottles of Coca-Cola, staring into the current. They never called it nostalgia. They called it peace. Time, like the tide, does not forget. 20 years after the war, men who once faced each other through barbed wire met again, not as enemies, but as friends. In 1964, a small reunion was held in Wisconsin. Former guards, local townspeople, and a handful of Japanese veterans gathered in a community hall. There were photographs on the walls. Young faces, uniforms, snow. Smiles that time had not erased. When the interpreter finished the introductions, there was a long pause. Then one of the Americans, now gray-haired and slow-moving, walked across the room and handed a paper-wrapped package to a Japanese guest. Inside, a bottle of Coca-Cola. The room erupted in laughter, and then applause. One of the former prisoners stood up and said, "When I was captured, I thought I would die in your camp. Instead, I learned to live." There were tears on faces that once knew only discipline. They shared stories of gardens built behind barracks, of chess games played with carved soap pieces, of songs sung in 2 languages, under the same stars. A journalist asked one of them later what forgiveness felt like. He answered, "It feels like breathing again." Not all came to the reunion. Some had died, others couldn't face the memories. But those who did, they carried more than history. They carried proof that mercy once given never disappears. In a world rebuilt on ashes, the kindness shown to a handful of prisoners had become something eternal, a quiet bridge between 2 nations. Decades later, when asked why he returned, one man said simply, "Because I wanted to see the people who fed me when I was hungry." The reporter paused. "And what did you say to them?" The man smiled. "Thank you for the hamburgers." History often remembers battles, but sometimes what defines us are the moments between them. In the cold mornings of Wisconsin, when the prisoners repaired fences or shoveled snow, the guards brought them coffee, not from pity, but from something simpler: humanity. One American soldier later said, "I didn't see enemies. I saw men who just wanted to go home for decades. That sentiment never made it into textbooks. The war needed heroes and villains. But real history, the kind that breathes, lives in small gestures: a cup of water, a smile through barbed wire, a shared song in the dark." When the war ended, the world moved on to new conflicts, new fears, new enemies. But those who lived through it carried something different. They had seen what kindness could do, even in captivity. They had seen that mercy could survive uniform, ideology, and war. Decades later, when historians interviewed the former prisoners, most didn't talk about weapons or battles. They talked about food, about the first taste of Coca-Cola, about hamburgers on tin plates, about how something so ordinary could feel like forgiveness. One man said, "We were enemies." But in that camp, for the first time, I felt what peace might look like. The echoes of that peace didn't fade. They grew into friendships, into families, into stories like this one. Because in the end, war destroys machines, but mercy rebuilds people. And long after the last shot is fired, the quiet acts of humanity are the ones that still speak. Wars don't end when treaties are signed. They end when the hate inside people finally runs out. For the men who tasted mercy behind barbed wire, the war ended not with surrender, but with understanding. Years later, when they spoke to their children, they didn't talk about enemies. They talked about people, about kindness that came in the shape of a meal or a blanket on a cold night. They carried those moments into the rest of their lives, quietly, without medals, without speeches. In the 1970s, one of them returned to Wisconsin. The camp was gone. The fields had swallowed everything. He found the place where the mess hall had once stood, and he laid a small offering on the ground: a hamburger wrapped in paper and a bottle of Coca-Cola. No ceremony, no audience. Just a man paying tribute to a kindness that had changed his soul. He stood there for a long time. Then he whispered, "This is where I stopped hating." The camera of history rarely lingers on such moments, but maybe it should, because this, not the flags, not the victories, is where wars truly end. Inside people. Inside the small, quiet decision to forgive. The men who once bowed to the emperor and swore to die for honor learned that mercy, too, is a kind of honor, that feeding your enemy can be more powerful than defeating him, and that in the ashes of history, humanity is the only thing worth rebuilding. One soldier's diary found after his death contained only a single line: "America fed me. Japan taught me. And I lived between the two. The war ended, but the humanity survived.